Intimidated because of two things. One, the title, he's the Chief Economic Advisor of Government of India. Secondly, I wasn't too sure if I was going to get his complete name in full, with the correct pronunciation and all that. So I asked him, what do I call you? He said, call me Subbu, I'm fine. I don't know if protocol is going to come in the way and if I'm going to get a letter from Prime Minister Modi tomorrow morning, but I think I'll stick to Subbu. So Subbu, welcome. We'll start with a song, I think. Is that what we're doing? We'll start with a song because I was just informed that you're a singer. And I also have realized, I think, your return from the United States, where you had a wager of $1,000 with a friend of yours. I'm pretty confident after just, meeting your wife now, I'm pretty confident it was because of the wife and not because of that $1,000 bet you had. It was because of the wife he returned back home. So welcome.
You know it very well.
Yes, I do. We are both married men. Let's start off, with a quick keynote by Professor Krishnamurthy Subramanian, and then we will get into the Q&A after a bit. So please take the podium and give us your insights. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, let me thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's really very pleasing to be back in Hyderabad, as the Honorable Minister was sharing and Secretary Jayesh Ranjan was saying. I've spent now close to a decade here, and I've loved the city, loved every part of being in Hyderabad, being at ISB. So it's really a homecoming for me, and really enjoy being here to sort of share my thoughts. Very briefly, I just want to set the stage for the way healthcare is. I'll talk less about how healthcare is, but try and paint a vision for how I view healthcare would be going forward, maybe 15, 20 years. If we think about, in many areas, India has leapfrogged the developed nations, and hopefully the vision that I articulate can actually be the starter for this leapfrogging that can happen in healthcare as well. So if you can have does anybody have a clip? Okay, yeah. Okay, so very broadly, if you look at some of the key problems or concerns that we face right now, if you look at the healthcare system in the Indian economy, you have poor financial protection, high out-of-pocket expenditures, and by out-of-pocket expenditures, these are expenditures that individuals, invest on their own healthcare. That's one key problem that we face in the country. There's clearly a need for improvement on outcomes in terms of measures of quality of healthcare. If you look at the hospitalization rates and the outpatient rates as well, when we compare with some of the other economies, these rates tend to be very low, and that's something that we need to work on. And then, as I sort of alluded to, there's suboptimal access to healthcare, quality healthcare, especially at the bottom of the pyramid, tends to be low, and the quality of that care is also low. And I just want to sort of outline, and this will be very useful when we discuss going forward as well. If you think about the role of government, and this is something that I've actually been quite conscious about, especially in our country. If you take any public good, whether it's actually healthcare is an important public good, but take any other public good, education or security, or it's any of those other public goods, people like us who are better off can get that public good in the private market. If, for instance, the government is not able to provide, let's say, good healthcare, we can go to private hospitals, but people at the bottom of the pyramid cannot do so. And that is something that is very important for us to recognize. Moreover, in India and in a lot of other countries as well, typically a shock that someone at the, a poor person, let's say, faces, a temporary shock can be something that creates permanent, a debilitation for such families. Therefore, the healthcare becomes extremely important, for the government to provide. Just quickly sort of examining on a sort of a cross-country comparison, this is a ranking of some countries. Notice we're actually close to Ghana in terms of the ranking. So we rank 143rd in the Committee of Nations. If we look across some of the neighboring nations, they're doing far better than us in terms of Sri Lanka 79th, Indonesia 91st, China 92nd, Thailand is also better than us. What is important, I want you to sort of keep this in mind when I show you some of the other statistics. Look at India's rank and then look at how the our spending and some of our other investments is. It's not that we are doing so poorly because we are spending extremely less on healthcare. As a percentage of GDP, if you look at these numbers here, we are in the same ballpark compared to all the other countries that I showed you. In fact, we are better than Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Thailand in terms of the spending that we do on healthcare. Yet, despite this spending, we are not doing very well in terms of outcomes, and that's something which we need to keep in mind. If we look at the out-of-pocket expenditure, this is something which is really important as policymakers that we need to be concerned about, that the out-of-pocket expenditure for individuals in India is way higher than that of the other countries, and that sort of is a telling sign on the healthcare sector as it stands today. One other aspect, and I just want to sort of leave that for thought, which is if you look at the rankings and also correlate it with the level of government control, what you will notice is that the level of government control is low in India, and that seems to have some correlation with the way we are performing compared to the many of the other countries where the level of government control of healthcare is much higher. And this is important because unlike some of the other sectors, and I come from the University of Chicago, which is said to be sort of a preacher of markets and the utility of markets, but what we have to recognize is that there are some reasons why healthcare may not be an industry where unregulated markets can necessarily be allowed to function. And that's because if you think about it, when you go to a doctor, you don't know as much about healthcare as the doctor knows. And this is something that we academics use this jargon called information asymmetry. The fact that the provider of healthcare knows a lot more than you do, and therefore you have to sort of place that trust in the doctor. But sometimes, when the provider is also the supplier, you can have conflicts of interest, and that becomes a concern that we have to keep in mind. A second aspect is that when you are sick, and that happens to all of us, we want to be, well tomorrow, day after. We actually are, really keen to get well as soon as possible, and that creates what we call in economics hyperbolic preferences, which is that we do not have the patience to wait for, and I think that's understandable, but this is a difference compared to other markets. If you think about other goods, sometimes we are willing to wait for, let's say, the right price or the right quality, but in healthcare that is something that is not affordable at all, and that is an important aspect of healthcare that we should keep in mind. Finally, none of us knows when we are going to become sick, when we may have to go and approach a hospital, when we may have to invest sort of expenditures. So there is significant variability and uncertainty. And you have to keep this in mind both from the supply side, which is the hospitals or the providers of healthcare, and from the demanders, in this case, the customers. Nobody knows actually, there is uncertainty and variability. So these three characteristics make healthcare an important area for government to think very carefully about the design of healthcare sector in the economy. And that is something, and so I want to leave this thought that just unregulated markets might lead to suboptimal outcomes, and therefore there is a role for government to think very carefully about the design of healthcare in the economy. So let me just, with that, just portray the way I see healthcare to be maybe 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Broadly, if you think about right now, if you think about healthcare is primarily curative. When you get sick, you end up going to a hospital. But healthcare need not be that way. It can be more preventive. There can be an emphasis on well-being and health. There might be, a use of various aspects of, economics, especially what is called behavioral economics. Recently, Richard Thaler got the Nobel Prize for what is called nudging people to actually do what is right for them. And healthcare is especially an area where that behavioral economics of nudge can be very useful, because many times we ourselves don't do, what is right for us, and that's where the behavioral economics of nudge can be very useful. So going forward, maybe if we look forward 15, 20 years ahead, healthcare need not be only about cure. Healthcare can be about well-being, about preventive medicine, and just ensuring that we all are healthy, and the visits to hospitals actually end up becoming lower. A second aspect, especially in the Indian context, I think, which is we must recognize the value that alternative medicine provides. I wish to relate this anecdote about in Hyderabad. My younger brother, who studied with me at IIT Kanpur, was a severe asthmatic, and on the recommendation of a few friends, he ended up coming here in Hyderabad for the fish medicine, took that medicine for 3 years, and followed all the restrictions that were asked for by the doctors to actually follow. And lo and behold, he actually has not been as asthmatic at all. He's really gotten cured. And this incident that I'm relating is about 20 years back. But that one incident actually made me start believing in the role that that alternative medicine, especially Ayurveda and homeopathy, etc., can play. Because the important difference, and as economists we talk about what is called general equilibrium versus partial equilibrium, which is, do you treat the human body as just a part versus a system? And one important aspect of Ayurveda and alternative medicine is that it treats the human body as a system, and understanding that if you try and change something at one place, there will be effects at other places, and treating the mental aspect of health also as a critical element to health, and that is an important aspect. So I can foresee 15, 20 years later that the diagnosis of ailments, which is an important aspect, which is a very subtle science in Ayurveda, that's where technology can come in a lot more, being able to understand the mental aspects and integrate that into medicine. Because particularly with some of these alternative medicines, it's the diagnosis that is the critical, and that's where technology can possibly play an important role. I think Secretary Jayesh Ranjan was talking about my fascination for technology. I'm trained as an engineer, but healthcare is one area where certainly there can be a huge role for technology. Just imagine if suppose there is a public health registry, which is that all the, when I go to a doctor, there is a centralized database from which he pulls out all the ailments that I've suffered from, right from my birth. And not only that, he's also using, maybe private sector providers are using the data that government puts out with all the necessary checks for secrecy and data integrity, but provides it to healthcare providers and for them to do analytics, which says the analytics then tells him, as soon as he looks at my file, it says, oh, Subbu, maybe you are actually at the onset of, early diabetes, God forbid not, but so maybe that prescription comes, and that predictive ability that analytics can provide can then lead to prescription saying, okay, you need to be watching the sugar intake that you're doing. So this is something that I think, and I don't think we need to even wait 15 years, but this is a real possibility, and that's where technology can play a huge role in being able to, and governments especially can play a role in this. Final aspect, and this is again where the industry, I think, can play a critical role, especially in sort of basic research. This word surgical strikes is in vogue, and I thought, why not a surgical strike on precise interventions on cancer cells. Nanotechnology and genome programming can help being able to actually get at the cells that are actually mutant, rather than having to actually do a carpet bomb of all the healthy cells around it as well. So 10, 15 years later, this may be also something that we may be looking at, and therefore cancer may not be the kind of fearful word that it is today. So that's with that sort of broad thoughts about the vision that I foresee for healthcare, over the next 15, 20 years, I would love to actually hear the thoughts of the Honorable Minister and interact with him. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Firstly, a clarification. I'm not a minister anymore. I think half the audience, especially, my friends from the press would be, writing a lot of stories about the fact that the chief economic advisor has called me a minister. I don't know if he's got some news that I don't have. Thank you, Subha. Thank you. That was comprehensive. I think you covered all bases. I am pretty much left with not many questions, but nevertheless, I'll do my bit. I'll ask you a few questions as well. You mentioned something very interesting. You talked about how sometimes lack of regulation or minimal regulation sometimes leads to suboptimal outcomes. That was the line you used. That was a phrase you used. But in my opinion, again, I'm trying to pitch in for the industry here. I've heard on this very forum, on this very dais from the industry. I met with a lot of medtech companies from the United States and Europe. I met with a lot of pharmaceutical companies also from India and abroad. All of them have one bone to pick with you. When I say with you, I mean Government of India. So the question that they have is, too much regulation in a country like India sometimes stifles outcomes, sometimes stifles innovation. Now, how do you balance these two? Regulation, too much regulation versus minimal or lack of?
I think that's an excellent question. We tend to not be very careful in terms of thinking about the right kind of intervention. As I was outlining, that healthcare, because of some of the difficulties and why the sector is different, may not be a sector where you could actually have laissez-faire. But that is not to say that every intervention is necessarily good. There are some kinds of interventions that may be better than others. What we also must do, I think especially is, and I think we, as a country, we need to be moving towards this, which is whenever we think about any intervention, we should be focusing especially on some of the unintended consequences, thinking about that very carefully, doing a careful cost-benefit analysis of that, and then, sort of go forward with the regulation. Just to give you without getting into specifics, the broad idea that I'm thinking about, this sector is something which is very technical, right? If you are thinking about, let's say, some quantity restrictions or price restrictions, let's say, those can be one way of, but there will certainly be effects of that in access to some people versus others. For instance, those people for whom, let's say, if I have to travel 20 kilometers, let's say, to be able to avail healthcare, even if the price is set, let's say, all over India, a particular price is set, the fact that I have to travel 20 kilometers or maybe 50 kilometers means that the cost that I am paying to be able to access that healthcare is very different from someone who's actually in the city. Let's say, for instance, we stay very close to continental hospitals, right? For us, it's a 2-minute drive to be able to go there. But take someone who's, let's say, in Warangal, if he or she wants to come to access continental hospital, the cost is different. Now, this is where one size fit all sometimes as regulation does not work very well, and calibrated thinking about the kind of costs that is involved is important. Let me be very clear. What I'm trying to say is I'm making 2 points here. One, that this is a sector that cannot be led to be just laissez-faire because of some of the frictions that I spoke about. But second point I'm saying is that is not a license for any kind of regulation. We have to be careful in what kind of interventions that we design.
All right. Just to extrapolate a bit on that same point, see, the industry, when it comes to drug discovery, when it comes to coming out with new drugs, spends billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars, and more often than not, they are not sure of the outcomes also, when you end up spending billions of dollars and when you're not sure about the outcome. And then when there is price control on drugs, when there is price control on medical devices, and medical technologies, that tends to scare them a bit, especially when somebody is looking to manufacture in India, especially when somebody is looking to enter India, especially when somebody is wanting to do more in India. Dr. Reddy's, Chairman Satish Reddy is sitting right here. Let me acknowledge his presence as well. And let me also add in what he was telling me the last time we met. Indian life sciences industry has been going through a bit of a rough ride over the last, especially last, less than a decade. The growth is dipped. They have now dropped down to single-digit numbers. And if they have to invest, not just Dr. Reddy's, but any pharma company, any biotech company today, if they have to invest billions of dollars into new drug discovery or new molecule discovery, they are worried about the fact that price control on drugs might come in the way of them investing big time. So this fine balance that you talked about, this calibration that you talked about, when I visit ministers in Government of India, when I meet the officials in Government of India, they're all gung-ho about Make in India. But they don't really seem to understand the practical concerns of the industry when it comes to execution on the ground. Now, as somebody who's now newly inducted into advising the government, would you then make an effort to actually be also a positive advocate for the change that industry has been wanting from Hyderabad especially?
Sure. So I think, what you've highlighted is an extremely important point. Some of my early research happened to be in innovation and entrepreneurship, and therefore I certainly recognize the fact that there is huge uncertainty. And that is why, for instance, if you think about it, and academically we talk about how perfect competition does not lead to optimal level of innovation. Why? Because if you expect that, so for instance, we think about in a perfectly competitive market, any provider will only get sort of the price is equal to marginal cost. That's not enough incentive for the company to be able to invest the huge dollars in their, and because that investment is actually risky, the likelihood of getting, discovering a new molecule, going through the clinical trials, there's huge uncertainty, which is why, generally, if you think about the industry structure itself, monopoly does not work very well because it breeds complacency. But oligopoly oftentimes, and sort of the research shows, leads to the most amount of innovation. So that there is any industry that actually where they invest the money to be able to do the R&D, there is enough returns for them to be able to, and that is something which is extremely important to keep in mind. But let me also give you the other angle, which is again because I've sort of worked on this and I've looked at some of the data very carefully without again going into specifics. When I've looked at some of and here I'm not talking necessarily about India, but other countries as well. Even when you look at prices of drugs, which are outside the patent, they basically have run through the patent period. In many instances, I've looked at that data. The prices can be about 12, 15 times the point of first sale, price of point of first sale, which then sort of makes you ask the question as well. That is this something which is actually, if the market were functioning perfectly, will you get that outcome is the question that you ask. Because definitely the reason patent regimes are provided, patenting actually, IPR regimes are there is precisely to incentivize the supplier to innovate. But once that 17-20 year period of patents is run through, that's when generics are allowed so that you actually have competition and access to that drug comes in. But if suppose you do not have, let's say, adequate competition, then you may get this outcome where the prices are 15, 16 times. We're talking about margins that actually are very large. So that's where, as a social planner, you start asking the other side of the question as well. And that's the balance that I'm talking about, that both sides actually, policy making is about trying to actually juggle many different stakeholders, the interests of many different stakeholders. And in healthcare, access is something that is very important as well. I'm not talking about, changing anything during the patenting. That incentive for innovation has to be there. But beyond that, when you actually have drugs that actually, that need to be accessed by a large section, I'm just posing the question, we may have to think about other stakeholders as well.
Understood. Since you talked about healthcare access and quality, healthcare access and quality, there is a global index, HAQ, which rates countries, across these two factors and gives out ratings. 1990, about, almost 3 decades ago now, India was ranked 153. 2018, India is ranked 143. So we just moved up 10 places. Assume for a minute, hypothetically speaking, you're not the chief economic advisor of India, but the Prime Minister of India, for a minute. I believe the place is also going to be vacant soon, just in case. Elections around the corner, don't read too much into it. All I'm saying is, if you are the Prime Minister of India, and if you had to do three things to make India jump not from 153 to 143 over a period of 30 years, because we all in this room would love to believe and like to believe that India has really made rapid strides of progress. We have done very well on many, many fronts, but healthcare, affordability, accessibility, availability of drugs, quality of medicine, quality of human life, living standards of the people in India. If you look at the numbers globally, it appears that we have not done that well, to pat ourselves on the back. So, what are the top 3 or 5 things that you would like to do,
So, let me sort of stick to my role and.
So you're not going to be the Prime Minister even hypothetically? All right. Kavita?
I'm going to do a, intricate language well left on that question.
All right.
The first thing I would actually talk about is so if we, as I was outlining, that the structure in healthcare markets oftentimes is a mix of oligopoly and oligopsony, which is, many buyers, not too many, okay, and similarly many sellers. Right? And that's what, again, when we look at internationally, is a structure that seems to work very well. So, whether at the state level or at the central government level, the government, is actually a buyer of services, whether it's actually through CGHs, for railways, health, defense sector, is buying in many different, but possibly in fragmented, more fragmented ways than we would like. Now, one way of sort of getting at that optimal structure that I've talked about is to combine that and maybe actually bring bargaining power. And thereby, when, as the government, you actually have the power to possibly be able to ensure quality as well, as a bigger buyer, right? That's something that I would think about, number one. Number two that I would think about is actually, and here's where I look at the reform that the template for reform that GST has provided as something which is which we need to understand and possibly be able to replicate. Because here you had an instance where center and the states came together to be able to decide on something that was best for the country as a whole, when there were some possible states actually which were, which may have in the short run to sort of lose, and others that were winning, and that's where the bargaining happened, and we were able to get it. So I would take that template and think about more federalism and greater cooperation between.
Can I
let me finish that point, and then I know let me on center and states. And again, the sort of to outline the vision here. Some of the spending that can be provided here could be based on, if it take the example of how venture capitalists fund startups in the health sector, let's say, right? They do a staged kind of financing based on outcomes. And that may be something, and that seems to have worked very well. Some thoughts about that can be brought in, saying, as a center, and sort of when we implement recommendations of the Finance Commission as well, can we make it more contingent on outcomes, and thereby incentivize sort of this race to the top among states, and that's the sort of vision that I'm trying to articulate in terms of the second aspect. A third, which I already spoke about, which is the data. And I think, again, governments are sitting on huge sets of data possibly here. Not only, are they sitting on data, but there's a possibility of triangulating. You have government data from possibly private health providers, and administrative data. And you combine all three to be able to create that foundation, that data infrastructure. Because again, when we think conceptually, government's role is to provide public goods. And in today's age, data and the insight that you obtain from data has become a public good. So the role that government should be providing is, with all the necessary checks and balances to ensure privacy, etc., create that infrastructure and create that backbone on which private sector can sit and then, leap from there, doing a lot of analytics and, ensure better service delivery, I think the sort of the possibilities are infinite there. Once the data starts coming in and being able to sort of combine different aspects of both qualitative and quantitative data. For instance, my blood pressure or let's say my sugar, level is a quantitative measure. But the way, let's say, I react to, to stress, or maybe the way I actually, how disciplined I am, let's say, is a qualitative aspect. The combination of those things actually can really provide you a much better holistic perspective on health. So these are sort of three broad things that I would talk about, in ways in which to take this sort of initiative forward.
I think I agree with you on point 1 and point 3. I have a bone to pick with you on point 2. You tangentially touched upon, this aspect of cooperative federalism and how the federal government and the state governments need to work together on alleviating, the healthcare access, quality, etc., etc. Now, the one question I have for you is, this is something that as an Indian, I am not, please don't think of me as a policy maker belonging to a specific party here in Telangana, but just as an Indian, as a citizen, what bothers me is, why is everything so centralized in India? I mean, when it comes to healthcare, since we are talking healthcare, why should somebody sitting in Delhi decide what is the kind of devolution of money on the health front that should be given to a primary healthcare center in a tribal village in Warangal district? Or why should somebody sitting in Delhi decide what is the quantum of money that needs to be given to the area hospital in Sirisila, my constituency? Why can't some subjects, such as health, education, be taken off the concurrent list, be given completely to the states, and let them, and give them the quantum of money that you had planned? For instance, just to give you, give you an inkling of what is really behind the point I'm trying to make. See, in Telangana and in Andhra Pradesh, in the erstwhile United State of Andhra Pradesh, the government, the then government, Congress government, had launched a program, a universal healthcare program called Arogyasri. This was about 10 years ago, about 2008. And it's been going on beautifully well. We spend about 900 plus crores every year. We cover nearly 1,000 ailments, and we provide comprehensive health insurance to the tune of 2 lakh rupees for about 100 crore, not 100 crore, but 1 crore families in Telangana. Now, of late a scheme, Ayushman Bharat, comes in. Now Government of India tries to tell us that that is better than Arogyasri, therefore you got to play along, you got to adopt. My question to you is, aren't there areas where we can take, our job more seriously? Can Government of India not just concentrate, I know I'm dragging you into politics a bit, can Government of India not take care of defense, external affairs, foreign policy, trade, commerce? There's enough to do. Why can't they leave healthcare and education why can't they push it into the state's domain, give a kitty of money and say, dovetail it to the existing program, or come out with something novel, depending on your state's, equation and situation? Do you not agree with it philosophically, or do you still see that, the Team India thing that Prime Minister Modi talks about is still relevant in today's context?
So that, I think,
I know you're new to the job, by the way.
That's an excellent question, and which makes me actually, as someone who actually likes thinking about these aspects, I would want to be even more ambitious in my thinking, and then say, why should states decide, how districts should be spending their money?
Absolutely, local governments, municipalities, Zilla Parishads, Mandal Parishads, why not? More the merrier, why not?
So we should definitely be, proceeding further.
He's become a politician already, by the way.
So we should be proceeding further along the lines of federalism. And I think I'm already seeing signs of that. I am an optimist, but this is not just based on optimism. Actually, looking at on monetary, if you look at, for instance, the implementations of the 14th Finance Commission, right? The devolution of funds to states has actually increased from 32% to 42%. I think there is, if we look at some of the the rankings, for instance, Telangana is doing so well on ease of doing business, right? Now, these are examples of states trying to compete, to sort of towards the top, right? A race to the top. not necessarily a race to the bottom. There are signs of actually healthy competition among states, which is being furthered, and I referred to GST already, which basically is a good step towards federalism. I think, I am taking on board the sort of the comment that you're making, but I would outline the vision that we need to definitely move towards greater federalism, not only at the state level, but state to district level as well. And that's a task that actually all governments, I think, should definitely be thinking very carefully about.
Understood. And one thing I would also touch upon from what you just mentioned. You talked about how in India we are focused more on curative, not really on preventive. Now, just to give you an insight of what the government of Telangana has been doing, we've in fact started a brilliant program called Kanti Velugu, which is screening of the eyes. It's eye care for all.
Yeah.
We've started screening of the eyes of every single citizen. We've already covered nearly 1.7 crore people on our way to completely comprehensively cover every single citizen in the state of Telangana. Then we are following it up with complete ENT checkup. Then it would be followed again by the dental checkup, which would again be followed by complete pathological tests, blood groups and all kinds of blood tests and everything else that needs to be done. And then our Chief Minister's dream is to build health profile of each citizen, thereby building the health profile of the state, and eventually digitizing everything, creating electronic health records of each and every single citizen of the state, thereby possibly becoming the first state in India to leverage technology so well, and also ensuring that we save a few lives in case there is an accident or there is a disaster somewhere. If people are rushed into an ER, it would definitely save a few lives if you're just able to bring up somebody's blood group, somebody's name, somebody's precondition, allergies, etc., by way of a fingerprint or iris, and that should save lots of lives. So just to give you a glimpse of why healthcare should be in the state's domain, because we have a larger control over state's machinery, I would strongly urge and strongly believe, since you are now advising Government of India, my appeal to you is, since you focused also on curative versus preventive and how preventive also should be put up right there as a priority, my advice, best practices of different states. I'm sure there are many states in India which are doing other things which are equally good, which are equally good and which are equally, worth emulation. So therefore my request to you, unfortunately we don't come together as often as a country, as often as states, to share best practices, to learn from each other. We're all operating in silos. My appeal, my request to you is, firstly, bring us together more often, advise Government of India to bring us more often together, share best practices, and also talk about how digitizing, leveraging technology, how it is going to help India as a country and Indians at large.
No, I think that's an excellent suggestion, and already, for instance, Secretary Jayesh Ranjan was talking about how yesterday I spent a good amount of time with all the senior officers, understanding some of the good work that is happening. I think as a country we should be trying to learn from our successes, irrespective of where that success happens. Because there is a lot of work to be done, and therefore we cannot be cherry picking where to pick the winners. Wherever there are winners, we should be picking and implementing, and that's part of that effort that my office is trying to actually do, which is to understand things that are working well, not only in Telangana but other states as well. That's an initiative that I will definitely hope carry forward.
Thank you. So one last question, unless we have any questions from the audience. One last question I have, and that's a very straightforward question. You talked about how technology can help in how technology can be leveraged in bringing about affordable healthcare to India. Now, we are sitting in one of the most interesting technology capitals in India, Hyderabad. You've lived here for 10 years. You know the city very well, and you know how, the city's capabilities. We have a beautiful, ecosystem when it comes to life sciences. 1/3 of world vaccines are produced here. 1/3 of India's pharmaceuticals are produced here. Information technology, we are number 2 only to Bangalore. We are doing tremendous work on innovation, not too far away from the ISB campus. You know the story. So my question to you is, now I even had a meeting, and I've even been to their facility. Novartis has a large office here. They're talking about digital drug discovery. They're talking about digital drug design. They're talking about how the interface, the interjunction of information technology and biology, life sciences, can actually herald, usher in affordable healthcare to the world at large. Since you're sitting in Hyderabad, since we're having this chat in Hyderabad, one of the leaders in life sciences and information technology, how can we, enable, how can we, get in more support from the private sector? How can we make it more attractive for, how can we make more attractive policies from Government of India's side, Government of Telangana's side, to make sure that we get more and more global players come in and leverage this wonderful interface that we've developed between the digital convergence between information technology and life sciences.
So again, that's I think an excellent question. Broadly, if we look at how innovation happens, innovation happens a lot through clusters. Hyderabad, as you already talked about, is one such cluster. Now, as an academic, I would urge that, and I think in India we have not focused as much on basic research. I think investment in basic research happens when we are more visionary, without necessarily asking for results from that research, 5 years later, or 10 years later. If I often give this example because, just sort of on a more informal note, when I would finish my teaching at ISB, students would ask me, Prof, when can we see you next? And I would say maybe 8 months later. And they'd say, why don't we see you often? And then I would tell them about how I actually spend the rest of my time doing research. And ISB is a place that has actually sort of really created that ecosystem. We need more of that. We need more universities doing basic research. And I also would give them the example of Ramanujam, right? At the time when Ramanujam was doing his work on number theory, there was no application of it, not even in the next 50 years. But today, if we look at, a lot of the algorithms that we see actually apply that number theory. I think that emphasis on just understanding the world, just basic research, without saying, okay, we need some returns from this, because a lot of the innovations that you're talking about and the next generation of innovations will come only when we actually also invest in basic research. And that's where I think our industry, I would sort of humbly request our industry to have that vision, that if they actually have to leapfrog and start becoming the sort of the innovators and the ones that create the new molecules, those molecules that are, let's say, used world over, right? Then they have to start working very closely with academia and fostering basic research. And here's where the industry government collaboration also is important. For instance, in the US, and you've been in many years there, the small business program, for instance, right, where some of the money was brought in by government, but the vetting of the proposals was done by private sector, because they understood very well that the expertise to vet those proposals sits in the private sector. I think some of those initiatives already I can see that some of those are being brought in, but more of those that needs to happen in general for our basic research too. I think so that's something that I would emphasize a lot on. In general, industry and government investing in basic research across the board, and I'm talking about not only healthcare but other areas as well. If we really have to act, if the next, let's say 30, 40, 50 years has to belong to India, then it cannot happen without large amount of investment in basic research and taking that forward. That is something which, and that also means actually wherever there is, for instance, some of the philanthropic money has to go into research. Yes, there is immediate returns from building a toilet, or let's say building, other giving food. But this is something that is long run. That is also something that we need to invest in general. Overall, I think in my own research, I've found that infrastructure, especially the soft infrastructure, is extremely important, and we do have enough of skilled manpower. Being able to sort of train them so that they also develop this the temper for research is also important, because if research has to happen, we have to have enough of skilled people who enjoy research, and that's the other sort of part of the ecosystem that I would strongly urge for us to build. I think, and finally, as I've already talked about, governments need to be thinking very carefully about how to create incentives for research, for creating that ecosystem. And without that ecosystem, without that clusters, I think some of the vision that I've articulated will, I think, sort of may not be fully achieved.
Fantastic. I loved exchanging some thoughts with you. I'd be remiss in my fiduciary responsibility if I don't mention the fact that, in fact, under your former dean and a former mentor, Ajit Rangnekar's leadership, we've started building...
Former and current mentor.
I'm sorry?
Former and current mentor. You know, mentors never become...
So what do you now? His Economic Excellency now, Ajit? Okay, His Economic Excellency Ajit Rangnekar's leadership. I must mention to you that we are, in fact, as Government of Telangana, along with the support of the industry here, we have started building on what is called as Research and Innovation Circle of Hyderabad, just to precisely bring about that collaborative effort between industry, academia, and with a market outcome-oriented, outcome-focused approach. So we are, doing something significant in that effort. And once again, many, many thanks. And if there are any questions for Subbu? Yes. Are we winding up? All right. Not even one question?
We thank you, sirs, for such a thought-stirring session. And now we would like to call Mr. Jayesh Ranjan on the stage to close the session and to felicitate the judges, to the esteemed guests.